Now, the Linux course will give you an introduction to Linux in OFS, this lesson rather, not the course. The course will give you a lot of information and mastery over Linux, and you will do that in due time during your studies here. But to prepare you for that, we thought we will give you a little chapter or a lesson on Linux, teach you, the basics of setting it up, how to navigate it, and the history of Linux, so you can see where it's from and where it's going. Now, you might have already used Linux before. You might be using Linux like now, you don't even know it, or you could be brand new to Linux. And Linux can be a bit confusing and frustrating for most of us because we are so used to the graphical user interface, like we saw in the previous lesson. And then you suddenly get hit by a command line and people are using terms like open source or just compile it yourself. Like, I don't know what to do. Well, Linux is, as we will see in the history of Linux, an operating system that was born from Linus Torvalds to be able to do his own thing. He didn't want to go the Microsoft route. He didn't want to go the Unix route. He wanted people to be able to collaborate and to be able to give the input and write their own software. And that comes with good things and bad things. Now, the good thing, basically, let's discuss it quickly. So let's say, what are the top 10 reasons why you would want to run Linux, either at home or your business or maybe at your school? Well, Linux is fairly secure. It's much more secure, in fact, in most instances than Windows or Mac, simply because it's built on security and how user rights work. And if you set it up right, and if you use, the best practices, it's going to be a very secure system that are constantly being evaluated by security experts and people that write code and develop things for Linux to make sure that it stays secure. And because on a Linux system, you will typically not just be admin or root, as they call it on Linux, you will be just a user and you can only do damage to your little user space. So the impact you can have on others or on the actual hardware or the kernel will be limited on Linux. Then Linux is also very secure. Sorry, not secure, stable. It comes with security, I suppose, but it's also very stable. Linux don't fall over easily. There's very seldom an issue with a Linux server. It can run for years and years and years. People have actually forgotten about servers, in a remote area of a building or in a basement. And then years later, when doing renovations, they suddenly find, oh, this server is still running. It's still doing things that we didn't even know that we were doing. It just keeps going. And that is also why most web servers and things on the internet are actually running on Linux. Even Microsoft loves Linux. They're one of the biggest contributors towards Linux. They want to make sure that it's protected and it moves forward and gets developed. And you will be able to run Linux things in Windows 10 and Windows 11 natively from the Linux terminal that they've developed for it. So it's a kind of a big deal. Then the other big thing is that Linux is easy to update. Typically, you as a user will have full control over it. Microsoft won't decide when it needs to patch, or Apple won't decide. You can decide when to patch. You can patch only a little bit, the bit that you think is insecure, or you can patch the whole thing, depending on the flavor you're running. And there's a lot of eyes on it, so it's a lot of people that make sure that things work the way they should work and they don't fall over. Then compatibility for Linux is also very, very good on most hardware. I wouldn't say all hardware because I've had instances where I simply could not get a wireless driver or a sound driver working in Linux on specific laptops or notebooks. And that is due to the driver for that laptop, for that hardware is probably proprietary. So it's not open source. So let's say it's HP or Dell or Realtek, they did not give the code to anybody to develop for Linux. It's only written for Windows or for Mac or whatever. And then you will often see the phrase, just write your own driver. Now, that's obviously not so easy for most of us because we're not all programmers and we don't all deal with that. So it can sometimes be frustrating, but your big Linux flavors like Ubuntu and Arch will have driver support for most things in there. Not everything, but most things. Then Linux is obviously completely free. You can use it without paying for it. Typically, there are paid versions for Linux, but you don't pay for the actual operating system. You pay for support or uptime. So you will pay to be not to have any issues. Let me just find my Linux machine quickly. I'm clicking through everything. Here we go. So this is Ubuntu server running on UTM with the desktop installed. I think it's a nicer picture than the Linux.org Foundation webpage. Then, like I said, it's open source. So it means it's free and open source actually. So it's FOSS, and it means developers, they have more eyes on it than anything else. Lots of people are looking into it, making sure things work, making things are developed. And because it's open source, it also means that anybody can run and develop for it. So nations that might have sanctions against them, so maybe North Korea or China, that cannot legally run Windows, they will probably write their own versions of Linux. And I just broke something. There we go. It doesn't like going to sleep. And yeah, so completely open source and free. It is generally easy to use, especially when you have a GUI like this, because I'm a Mac user primarily, and I obviously know Windows. But I mean, I can find my way around Linux. This is Ubuntu server with the desktop installed by simply, using my eyes. The GUI is stable, it's good, it makes sense. They've got shortcuts here. Then it can be customized. You can decide what kind of desktop do you want to run Linux. Now, most of them will come with GNOME or KDE, which are two different types of desktops that you can run. There are many more, and you can go nuts. You can customize as much as well. You're not locked in. You can't it's not just the theme, it's the entire desktop that is different. Then Linux is very important, obviously, for freedom of choice reasons and security reasons, like we said, and for privacy reasons. So you can lock it down. It's not going to phone Amazon. It's not going to talk to Google if you don't want it to. And it's good for education because you don't have to pay for it. Not everybody has the money to buy 100 or 1,000 or 2,000 licenses for Windows. Everybody can download Ubuntu. So if the students have the hardware or they are sharing hardware, Linux is a great way to get students up and running. And then obviously support. Like I said, usually there is a paid module to Linux where you have to pay for a version, but you don't actually pay for the software, you pay for support for the software. And Linux is full of thousands, if not more, hundreds of thousands, I suppose, developers and enthusiasts like here on Linux.org, when you can go and dig through tutorials to see how to do what. You can find different versions to download. You can post in their forums to talk about security or hardware or gaming and networking. So this is a very good URL to save if you're an enthusiast. And yeah, so these are 10 really good reasons why you should at least try Linux. Don't just dismiss it as something you're going to use for hacking or just if you're going to use once or twice. The world actually runs on Linux, strangely enough. Every server that we use are mostly Linux. There's a few things that's still Windows. This is also a very good resource, the Linux Foundation guys, where you can contribute to code, you can look at code, you can work with developers. It's a neat site, and Linux.org is a neat site. So I hope you enjoy the rest of this lesson, and hope this gives you an idea of why are we looking at Linux, why are we telling you to look at Linux, because it's so strange. If you just have ever used Windows, it's a very different environment. It's a different thing to get your head around. So in this lesson, we're going to go take you through the history of it. There will be a nice little TED talk to talk to you about the mind behind Linux, like Linus himself. Then we're going to do a practical installation of Ubuntu Linux into a VMware workstation or VirtualBox, and also into UTM for the Mac M1 users that I just demonstrated to you how I use it. So you can see that it is possible to run on just about any platform.